They call them a lion among men. He built the most feared war machine Africa had ever produced, turning a minor clan of fewer than 1,500 people into an empire that stretched across 11,000 square miles. He made British colonial commanders sweat through their redcoats without firing a single shot. But no British bullet ended Shaka Kasenzangakona. A blade from inside his own bloodline did. If you have never heard the full story of what happened on the night of September 22nd, 1828, and who truly held the spear, stay until the very end, because what unfolded inside the royal kraal at Guaducusa is one of the most consequential acts of betrayal in the recorded history of Africa. The men who did it were trusted at the highest level. The man who made it possible slept within arm's reach of the king. And the reason this story was buried for nearly 2 centuries has everything to do with who writes history and who gets written out of it. Subscribe. Hit the notification bell. This is the truth they never taught in school. To understand the depth of what was betrayed, you first have to understand what was being built. Before Shaka Kasenzangakona became king in 1816, the Zulu were one of dozens of small chieftainships scattered across the rolling hills of what is today KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Their territory was modest, their army was small, their name meant nothing to the surrounding peoples. What happened between 1816 and 1828 still staggers historians who study it today. When Shaka seized the Zulu chieftaincy, taking it from his half-brother Sigujana shortly after their father died, King Senzangakona, he immediately began dismantling everything about how Southern African warfare worked. The long-handled throwing assegai was discarded. In its place, he introduced the ikla, a short-handled, broad-bladed stabbing spear designed for close, brutal, decisive combat. The large cowhide shield became an offensive weapon, trained to hook the left edge of an enemy's shield, twist it inward, and expose the opponent's armpit for a single lethal thrust. Distance fighting was replaced by controlled aggression at arm's reach. He reorganized the army into Amaputo, age regiment formations, where young men from across conquered territories were absorbed into Zulu regiments, fed, housed, trained, and forbidden from marrying until the king personally granted permission. This bound their entire identity and loyalty to Shaka alone, not to their home clans. It was psychological military engineering as much as physical training. A warrior who could not marry, could not farm, and could not go home owed his entire life to one man. Then there was a formation that would later make military historians across the world take notice: Isimpondo Zankomo, the horns of the buffalo. 2 flanking forces, the horns, would sprint wide to encircle the enemy, while the main body, the chest, engaged directly. A reserve force called the loins sat behind the chest with their backs deliberately turned so they would not get caught up in the excitement and charge prematurely. They were deployed only when the horns had fully closed the trap. It was systematic, it was patient, and it was almost always lethal. With these innovations, Shaka expanded the Zulu kingdom from a territory of roughly 100 square miles to an empire stretching over 11,500 square miles in just over a decade. The displacement of populations caused by Zulu expansion sent waves of refugees and cascading conflict across the entire southern African interior, a period historians call the Mfecane, meaning the crushing or the scattering. Entire ethnic groups were forced hundreds of miles from their ancestral lands. By 1828, Shaka commanded a standing army estimated at between 40,000 and 50,000 warriors. No colonial power had yet dared to test it directly. The Zulu king was, by every military and political measure, the most powerful ruler in sub-Saharan Africa. And yet, in September of 1828, he was dead. The seed of what would become the empire's most catastrophic betrayal was planted with painful irony, with grief. In October of 1827, Shaka's mother, Nandi, died. Nandi was not simply a mother to Shaka in the conventional sense. She had been the one fixed point of protection in a childhood defined by rejection and humiliation. When Shaka was young, his father king, Senzangakona, had expelled Nandi and her illegitimate son from the Zulu clan. They lived in exile, moving between chieftainships, never fully belonging, always reminded of their outsider status. The bond between Shaka and Nandi was forged in that shared suffering. Her death broke something inside him that his enemies on the battlefield never could. What followed was a mourning period so extreme that contemporaries recorded it with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Henry Finn and Nathaniel Isaacs, early British traders who had established direct contact with the Zulu kingdom and whose written accounts remain among the primary sources for this period, both documented what they witnessed and were told by eyewitnesses. Shaka ordered that no crops be planted. No milk, the cornerstone of the Zulu diet and economy, could be used for the duration of mourning. Pregnant women and their husbands were reported to have been executed. Thousands of Zulu civilians were killed in the weeks following Nandi's death as Shaka's Indunas carried out his commands, with some historical accounts placing the figure between 7,000 and 12,000 dead. The mourning period was eventually lifted, but the damage was irreversible. The terror that had once been directed outward at enemies on the borders of the expanding empire was now turned inward. Food production had been disrupted for months. Cattle herds, the measure of Zulu wealth, prestige, and stability, had been neglected. The people were exhausted, hungry, and privately afraid of their own king in a way they had never been before. Even the most loyal Indunas began to exchange glances that no one would have dared exchange 2 years ago. Then, in 1828, Shaka pushed his commanders to their absolute breaking point. He dispatched a major military campaign southward against the Mpondo people near the frontier of the Cape Colony. That alone was not unusual. What was deeply unusual, and what landed like a death sentence across the Amabuto, was that he then immediately dispatched a second army before the first had returned. Warriors who had been on campaign for months, who had been marching, fighting, and surviving on campaign rations across difficult terrain, were given no recovery period. Regiments that should have been home managing cattle and preparing for the planting season were still away from their corrals. The grumbling inside the royal household, always dangerous to voice, became impossible to fully suppress. The whispers found their way to two men who had both the motive and the proximity to act on them. Dingane Kasenzangahona and Mhlangana Kasenzangahona were Shaka's half-brothers, sons of the same father by different mothers, both occupying positions within the royal household, both carrying royal blood in their veins, and both acutely aware that Shaka had produced no recognized heir. The succession was an open wound. Shaka could maim a successor, or he could refuse to. Either way, both men understood that in a kingdom where power transferred through blood and violence, the only safe position was on the throne itself or in the grave. Shaka had already demonstrated that he viewed his half-brothers as threats to be managed. A previous half-brother had already been eliminated. Dingane was not naive. He understood the precedent. He also understood, as a man who had spent years watching Shaka operate, that the window for action was not infinite. But Dingane and Mhlangana faced a problem that could not be solved by ambition alone. The royal corral was guarded. Access to the king was controlled. You could not simply walk into Shaka's presence with a weapon. You needed someone on the inside, someone who managed the king's movements, his daily routines, the layout of his compound, someone the king trusted entirely. That man was Mbopa Kasitai. Mbopa was not of royal blood. He was not an Induna of a regiment. He was Shaka's personal household attendant, the man responsible for the king's private affairs and the management of the royal residence at Gwa Dugusa. He controlled access. He knew the king's habits and schedule with the intimacy that only daily proximity creates. Without Mbopa, the conspiracy had no path to execution. With him, it had a door left deliberately unguarded. Why did Mbopa betray the man he served most closely? Zulu oral tradition, recorded by later historians, offers competing explanations. Some accounts hold that Mbopa bore a personal grievance, that Shaka had wronged a member of his family in a way that demanded retribution under Zulu customary law. Others suggest he was persuaded and possibly coerced by Dingane and Mhlangana, who understood that a man in Mbopa's position carried more operational value than any prince. What every historical account agrees upon is that Mbopa's participation was deliberate, calculated, and essential. The date of September 22, 1828, is recorded in the historical record with unusual precision for its time, partly because of those written accounts left by Finn and Isaacs, who documented what eyewitnesses reported in the days and weeks that followed. The main Zulu army was still deployed on the southern campaign. The Zulu kraal at Gwadukuza, located near what is today the town of Stanger on the KwaZulu-Natal coast, was therefore thinly garrisoned. Dingane and Mhlangana had chosen their moment with deliberation. That evening, a delegation of envoys arrived at Gwadukuza from a neighboring chieftainship. Chaka was present in the cattle kraal, the central open space of the royal compound, to receive them. He was reportedly in poor spirits and rebuked the delegation sharply before dismissing them. As the delegation departed and the area emptied, 3 men moved. Dingane, Mhlangana, and Mbopa Kasitai converged on Chaka in the cattle kraal. He was attacked with stabbing spears. He was struck multiple times. According to Zulu oral tradition, as recorded by later historians, including A.T. Bryant and James Stewart, whose extensive documentation of Zulu oral history in the early 20th century remains a foundational academic resource, Chaka turned in his final moments to look at who had attacked him. He reportedly said, "What is wrong, children of my father? Do you think you will rule this land after killing me? It will never be governed, even with the whites." Whether those exact words were spoken or were attributed to him through the shaping power of oral tradition, the prophecy they contained proved historically devastating. Chaka Kasenzangakona, founder of the Zulu Empire, died on September 22, 1828. He was approximately 41 years of age. His body was buried in an unmarked grain storage pit at Gwadukuza. No ceremony, no marker. The man who had reshaped the history of an entire subcontinent was hidden in the ground under silence so that Dingane could consolidate power before word reached the army still in the field. What followed illustrates something essential about the nature of power and about the particular poison of betrayal. It almost never ends with a single act. Within weeks of Chaka's murder, Dingane turned on his co-conspirator. Mhlangana, who had helped drive the spear that killed the king, was himself killed on Dingane's orders. The man who had helped create the new king had become, in that new king's eyes, a rival with a secret too dangerous to allow him to live. The conspiracy had consumed one of its own architects before the blood on the cattle kraal floor had dried. Dingane assumed the Zulu throne. He possessed political cunning but not Chaka's military genius, and critically, he lacked the commanding authority that Chaka's formidable personal presence had provided. He was a king who ruled through fear and suspicion, in a kingdom that had been built on discipline, loyalty. The difference mattered enormously. In February of 1838, Dingane invited a party of Voortrekker settlers, Boers moving north from the Cape Colony, into diplomatic negotiations over land. Their leader, Piet Retief, arrived at the royal corral with a party of approximately 70 men. After days of negotiation, on February 6, 1838, Dingane invited the Boers to a final celebration. They were asked to leave their weapons outside the corral, as was custom. When they complied, Dingane gave the order. Retief and every man in his party were seized, marched to the nearby execution hill of KwaMatiwane, and killed. It was a calculated political act, but it unleashed a chain of military retaliation that the Zulu Empire, fractured from within and led by a king without Chaka's strategic instinct, could not absorb. On December 16, 1838, at the Ngome River, a force of approximately 470 Voortrekker settlers, Boers moving north from the Cape Colony, repelled a massed assault by an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 Zulu warriors. the Ngome ran red with blood. It became known as Blood River. For the Boers, it was a covenant with God. For the Zulu, it was the opening of a wound that would not close for generations. Dingane fled northward. He was killed in 1840, not by the Boers, but by the Swazi, in territory far from the land his half-brother had bled and built. His own half-brother, Mpande, who had allied himself with the Voortrekkers to take the throne, replaced him. The throne of the greatest military empire in African history had changed hands 3 times through assassination, conspiracy, and foreign alliance in fewer than 12 years. The colonial narrative of the 19th century had a vested interest in a particular version of events. The story it needed was one in which the fall of the Zulu Empire was the inevitable product of European military superiority advancing against a less developed civilization. That story was clean. It fit the justification for colonization. It made the conquest of Southern Africa look like the natural order of history rather than a political project built on land theft and racial hierarchy. A Zulu kingdom destroyed by British rifles could be folded into that narrative without much difficulty. A Zulu kingdom whose collapse began with the assassination of its own founder, carried out by his half-brothers and his most trusted household attendant, deep inside a royal kraal on a September evening in 1828. That story required a more honest reckoning. A story about internal ambition, royal blood feuds, and the fragility of even the most powerful empires when loyalty is purchased rather than earned. That story belonged to no single civilization. It was disturbingly human, and it complicated every clean line the colonial account depended upon. The name Mbopa Kasitai does not appear in most general histories of Southern Africa. The political crisis of 1828 and its direct consequences are treated as a footnote where they are mentioned at all. Generations of students across the world have been taught the date of the Battle of Isandlwana, January 22, 1879, without being taught the date of September 22, 1828, the night that set the Zulu Empire on the road that ultimately led there. History is always written by those who survive it, and survivors choose very carefully what they remember. Shaka Kasenzanga Kana built something extraordinary. He was not a peaceful man. He ruled through calculated terror as well as through strategic genius, and the suffering he caused across southern Africa through the Mfecane was real and fast. History must hold all of that. But the civilization he constructed, its military architecture, its administrative discipline, its psychological sophistication, was a genuine achievement of African governance that colonial historians spent generations deliberately minimizing. What destroyed it was not superior European technology. The British did not defeat the Zulu Empire first. Dingane, Mlangana, and Mbopa Kasitai did it on a September evening in a cattle kraal, with 3 spears and the cold silence of a freshly dug grain pit. The oldest and most human of weapons has never needed iron or gunpowder. It has always needed only proximity, access, and the willingness of those trusted most to use both. That is the story history forgot. Now you know it. If this story moved you, if you believe this truth deserves to be heard, share this video right now, because stories like this survive only when people choose to pass them on. Drop a comment below and tell us, did you know any of this before today? And subscribe for more untold histories from across the African continent, because there are dozens more stories exactly like this one, still buried, still waiting. The next video is already there. Don't let it wait long.